Thank you for attending my first and final contribution to the material culture group here at CU. My name is Jack Wilson. I am a specialist in the Mongol Empire, especially for the Golden Horde in the late 13th century, but my work tends to look at a lot of aspects of the Mongol Empire over the 13th, 14th century. So for today's discussion, I'm going to give something of an introduction to sort of uses of silk in the Mongol Empire, why the Mongols were interested in it, what they were doing with it, and things like that. So when people picture the Mongols, they picture someone who looks something like this. This is how Genghis Khan appears in the 1989 feature film Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, where he's basically like a caveman covered in furs and things. And this is typically how people will picture the Mongols in the 13th century, just a bunch of guys with raggedy bits of fur and leather straps kind of hanging off of them and big clubs they're hitting each other over the head with. But our more historical Mongols are dressed a lot more like this. This is kind of our typical pre-conquest clothes from the 12th century, 13th century, and into the post-conquest era, more or less up until the 1600s, 1700s, where these clothing forms start to change. And similar styles of this are still worn in Mongolia today. This is a type of clothing typically called belch in modern Mongolian, belch in 13th century Mongol, or some styles called terlik, which we will be looking at over the course of this. And a lot of these articles of clothing are made out of silk, and we're going to be discussing some aspects of this. This is a material they valued very highly, and especially for the upper classes, the elite, just about all of their articles of clothing will be made out of silk. And some of the typical features that we will be looking at for the clothing later on. You see this ties on the right-hand side under the arm. You have kind of this cinched waist, often with like a waistband around that where their belt runs. You have these long sleeves, but they get narrow at the wrist, and the skirt, which comes down below the knees, but kind of the middle of the shins, and often with a big hat on top. And this is the same for men and women. And kind of the symbols of a free man in kind of Mongolian speech is a guy who has a hat and a belt, and the way they supplicate before the Khan is you remove your hat and your belt as a sign of submission to him. This is an image from maybe 14th century Mongol-ruled Iran. And as the Mongol Empire expands, well, obviously at the start of the conquests, 12th century, very early 13th century, there's not a lot of silk in Mongolia. But as the empire expands, vast quantities are collected through either what is taken through looting cities or paid as tax and tribute. And we see it used for all sorts of things, which we will be discussing in a moment, but I just want to set up firstly, the most common kind of claim you hear about the Mongols and silk is that the Mongols are wearing silk shirts for the purposes of stopping arrows. This is a myth that emerges in the early 20th century. I believe the fellow's name was Michael Probden, was the oldest source I could trace this to. And it appears for him, he's writing in 1930s Germany, first of all. And he writes this very popular book about the Mongols. The Nazis love it, so that's always a great sign. But part of his claims is that the Mongols are wearing silk shirts for the purposes of stopping arrows. And it seems that what happened is he had claims of Mongols wearing silk, and because he's seen the Mongols as kind of this warrior martial race, well, they can't be wearing silk for any feminine reasons, like that it's nice to wear or something. So it has to be a military reasons that they're stopping, or that they're wearing silk. And the one he comes across, combined with some other tests that were happening from people's efforts to try and make bulletproof vests at the time, the solution he comes across is that they were wearing wearing silk for special properties in either stopping arrows or making them easier to remove or something. Silk does not have those properties. Do not try and wear a silk shirt as protection against projectiles. It will not do you any good. But that is neither here nor there. So let's talk a bit about some of the uses that we see for silk. And really, the Mongol elite are using it for everything. What we have right here is one of my favorite examples. This is a bow and arrows and arrow case found with a burial of a Mongol nobleman in a cave named Saganthad in Mongolia. And the reason I'm showing it is because the bowstring is made out of silk here, which stayed taut for the 800 years this guy was buried, and like so strong that where there had been a repair in this bow, it actually pulled that repair like out of place, and that's why the bow is warped like this. And so this is just one example, but they are really using it for all sorts of things. It is used essentially as a currency in barter. The taxes can be assessed or paid. In silk, exchange is often done on the silk backed by silver or silver backed by silk. It's delivered as tribute from conquered states. It is given as reward for Mongol princes, for envoys, for soldiers who showed valor in combat. And I mean, they're being rewarded as like bolts of silk, like kind of raw silk, or as finished articles of clothing. We have for the elites, they're using it for cord and rope. They're using it in Confucian rituals and ceremonies, and even covering the interiors of their gers or yurts. Their felt tents are covered with silk, even as carpets, or basically coverings to put over their carts, as well as kind of help them be a bit more waterproof. And even the wealthy are lining their garments with silk to help keep them warm. So you can almost picture them taking like lumps of silk and like stuffing it into their boots as kind of help extra insulation in winter. It specifically described how the poor people had to suffice with just like bits of fur, like animal fur and stuff to put in there instead. And now, because the Mongol courts wanted such a tremendous quantity of silk, and they're obviously collecting a lot through conquest or through tribute and taxation, but they're also transporting weavers across the empire for servicing the needs of the court. So you see weavers coming from China or Central Asia, Iran, are being sent across Central Asia or deep into Mongolia, up into the Yenisei River Valley for the purposes of weaving and producing silk for what the court wants. And they're often instructed to kind of combine techniques or designs from these different parts of the world. We will see an example in a few minutes here. Now, regarding clothing, the most notable in this regard is a type of clothing called jisun, which the word I think comes from the Chinese originally, but it just means color. And what these are expensive robes of one color made of a particular silk weave called in Mongolian nashishi, but in other languages is naj or nasij, najnach, which is a lampas weave, which is so a two-layer weave. So you have in the back is kind of your more structural, was holding things together, and then there's kind of a decorative layer on top, which is gold and silk, gold thread and silk woven together, and sometimes with apparently precious jewels even woven into that as well, to give them a very rich, exotic, probably glimmering sort of appearance. And this is what the Khans are giving as rewards or gifts to members of their court, their bodyguards. Apparently there would be feasts where everyone would show up in robes of matching color, and then the next day of the feast they would show up in another robe of the same style but a different color. And this is seen as a very typical clothing of the Mongolian elite. The clothing of the common Mongol and the elite Mongol is supposed to be the same in cut and overall design. What the difference is the material they are made out of. And I have some examples we will see here right now. So this is a robe found from a burial of an upper class, but not like the top 1%, but upper class guy from Mongolia. I think it was dated to the early 14th century, and he was buried with three robes of this design. And you see some of our typical features again with the tie under the right side. This is again the lampas weave. This was, I think this one had been green, yeah, green originally. With the, so that it's made of silk with a gold thread, and you see this waistband, cummerbund, sometimes called, wrapped around the center, and these extra pleats in front. So you have the extra fabric which comes up in front, because if you're nomads, you don't have kind of a big palace to show off your wealth. So you kind of show off your wealth by wearing it, and you show how wealthy you are by going, look, I have so much of this silk and gold, this wonderful weave, that I have extra fabric that can be bunched up around, and the pleats, kind of like you would see on the back of a kilt. And even these clothing, or these elite articles of clothing, though, are still made to be very functional. These are still people who have to be riding horses and stuff, so they're cut in a way that you can still get up on top of a horse without much difficulty and be comfortable riding. And this is one of those things that distinguishes the elite Mongolian styles from elite Chinese styles, for example, where an elite Chinese style is very long, baggy clothing, like right down to the feet, for example, which is very inconvenient for getting on a horse, for example. So in the succeeding dynasty to rule China after the end of Mongol rule, the Ming dynasty, they are still, for when going on hunting trips, the emperor and the princes and his guards, for example, are still going to be wearing this very Mongol influenced style of robe, just because it's still a very effective design, while still being able to show off your wealth and power. These are other two examples from this burial that the previous one was from, and you can see visually very similar, but there are some minor differences. So for example, this one, we still have the pleats at the front. This one, though, lacks the pleats at the front, and instead just has it kind of folding out at the sides kind of thing. So there are minor differences in the designs, and you can see this lovely ornamentation called cloud pattern going across the chest and shoulders. And that is here a reconstruction of how this would have looked like, probably not with jeans originally, but this kind of look is how it would have been worn. To start, you see our narrow sleeves, or the tight waistband here, tying under the right. Yes, and here's just a few more examples of this from different parts of the Mongol Empire, showing how this was worn. So this is from Dagestan today in southern Russia, dated 14th century. You see again, here's our waistband, here's our cloud pattern collar. So this is presumably depicting an upper class guy who is wearing one of these styles of robes. So this is from the Mongol rule in China, from the Yuan dynasty. And then this is a painting from Italy into the 14th century, the martyrdom of the Franciscans, which is often suggested to be showing the murder of a bunch of Franciscans in Almalik, a city ruled by the Mongols. And we see the guys who painted it had some awareness of what this elite Mongol clothing looked like, and made some efforts to try and depict it. And even this style of upturned brim on the hat and the back flap, that is something we see very typical of these Mongolian hats, with large feathers coming off the top. So someone who knew what they were doing and even tried to emulate some of the facial hair a little bit. So it's a very nice piece. I quite like it. And then these are depictions of the emperors, of the great Khans from the Yuan dynasty, and kind of showing off some slightly plainer ones, because they like to show the emperor kind of a bit more humble to an extent. But you see the tying under the right arm. This is what I was saying, this hat over there. This is probably the style of hat that they're trying to emulate. And again, for these upper class guys, it's looking the same as the common Mongol stuff, but these are probably all nice, comfortable silk robes, but not trying to show the golden silk weave that I was talking about before. This is an up-close look at some surviving pieces of the nasij, or nashishi, this gold and silk lampas weave here. And what we see on these surviving examples like this is you have these Persianate style, like rondels and lions, but at the same time are mixed in Chinese style dragon heads, cloud patterns in there. And what the suggestion for this particular one was that this was made by a person trained in Persianate style of weaving, but then who was transported somewhere across the Mongol Empire and told to try and emulate certain aspects of Chinese design. So didn't quite understand it, didn't quite understand what it all meant, but could visually see it and try and capture a little bit of it here. So these are some more surviving examples from the 14th century. Now, again, these are upper class ones. You can't really make them out too well in the photograph, but these are the gold weave again, and you can see kind of the designs sewn into them, this tight sash, but also these really long sleeves. Does anyone have any guesses what the purpose of really long sleeves are?
Your hands warm in the winter?
So there's not a lot of gloves in 13th century Mongolia. And you have to remember, even upper class garments are still made to be functional. So when it's cooler out and you want to be holding on to the reins of your horse, what you do is these sleeves are normally kind of tied back a little bit. So it comes down to the wrist, but the extra fabric is like here around the arms. And then if it's cold out, you untie them and it comes forward and can kind of cover your hands like that, and you can hold your reins or something in there. I did not wear a long enough shirt to do that, but you get the idea. What it also does is, because these guys are always wearing multiple coats, so they'll have this one underneath, and then they'll have a second short sleeve coat on top of that. So it'll be like the same length, but the sleeves are only coming like to here, sort of thing. This way, you get to still show off as much of your fancy silk and gold weave clothing as possible. You can just see that they have a nice one on top and then another nice one underneath coming out all of this way. So this is a good way to make sure you're showing off as much as possible. Very ostentatious displays of wealth. This is an example that is held in the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto. Probably the only reason you'd want to go to Toronto, in my opinion. But you get a nice sort of zoomed in look at these rondos, these designs that are built onto that. And what I'm trying to show in part here is how consistent a lot of these features are. We've looked at examples from basically across the breadth of the Mongol Empire, these archaeological examples, some of these visual depictions, and there's a lot of textual descriptions as well. And they're always very consistent in how these features look and appear. So it was kind of this very clear of what it meant to be a Mongol elite, how they're supposed to look. And this has a lot of influence on the states that succeed the Mongol Empire. You can trace some of these designs through the Ming Dynasty or down through to Mughal rule in India, for example. This is a depiction of two great Khans from Mongol ruled China, dated to 1329, on a mandala that was donated to, I forget what it was a Buddhist monastery or something now. So first of all, this is a painting done on silk, depicting two great Khans wearing silk. So two brothers, this guy was Khan, and then he gave up the throne for him and then killed him, and then he became Khan again. That's why it's kind of weird with the reign dates. But you see, here's our two coats on top of each other. So we have the long sleeve underneath, and then the short sleeve on top in order to showcase both of the outfits. And again, showing the Mongols' interest in the combining certain designs from across the empire. You know, the Chinese style dragons, kind of the symbol of the emperor, all over both of their coats and sleeves here. Now we'll talk a little bit about the women's clothing. Now, unmarried women's clothing is said to look basically exactly the same as the men's clothing, but when a woman gets married, especially an upper class woman, there's certain kind of features that we associate with it. So one of them is that the clothing becomes longer, more voluminous. They don't tend to wear belts. And this is one of the Mongol euphemisms for a married woman is buskui, which means a beltless person. And there's a very particular style of hat we'll talk about in a moment. This is a fun one from another burial of an upper class woman. So again, it's all silk except for these cuffs and collars, which would have been visible underneath her coat she would have worn on top of this. But this one, we have again tie under the right arm, but it doesn't actually open. It's just been made in such a way to still appear to open, but this is actually a pullover, which I thought was a very interesting one. Like they're going, this is how clothing's supposed to work, and they almost can't imagine making clothing that doesn't look like this. These are more examples from the same woman's burial, a winter coat, a ceremonial coat. Ceremonial one, of course, all silk, exactly what we're saying, but this is kind of unique for tying on the left-hand side, which is otherwise seen as a very not Mongolian thing to do. Like it's to the extent that some people in the 13th century are saying Turks will tie theirs on the left-hand side and Mongols always tie theirs on the right-hand side, and that's how you tell them apart. But the most iconic feature of the married Mongolian woman's clothing is the bokta, which is this very tall hat that she wears upon getting married. Now, before the conquest era, this is seems to be made out of like a stick frame and then some sort of fabric making the exterior. But during the conquest era, this becomes a bronze or wire mesh wrapped around with silk, and can extend like an arm's length on top, and then on top of that you have ostrich or owl feathers in particular put on top of that, and then decorated with gold and especially pearls. Pearls are seen as this really the most precious of all of the natural jewels you can come across. They're kind of obsessed with pearls. So to see someone with this many pearls on them, it would be sort of a like an extreme display of wealth. She's wearing like 6 Rolexes like hanging from her hair sort of thing for a modern comparison. I don't know why particular pearls are so favored. Maybe there just wasn't a lot of them in Mongolia before the conquest, so it was a easy way to show off the extent of the things that you can pull in from across the world, which they really liked to do as well. And these series of paintings, these are all painted ink on silk as well. This one though, or this series was, it is argued, kind of test portraits. So they're just like the bust, like the shoulders and head up. And they were kind of models for larger full-size scale paintings that would have been hung in a hall to kind of venerate all of these figures once they died. So they're all kind of made shortly after their death and probably have a degree of this is how this person actually looked. But you would have had a full-size portrait of these individuals made on silk, which is, I mean, a stunning use of silk, far beyond just wearing it because it's going to stop arrows. This is just a couple more depictions. This is the wife of one of the Khans we looked at from that mandala, and she again showing these consistency of how the robes are worn. You see the woman's clothing, there's no belts, you have this dragon design, this extra volume of the material, her tall hat, the bokta, and the gold, they're not earrings, they hang from the hat itself, but the jewelry. And it's not so easy to see now, but it would have had the pearls on there as well. And you see a very similar depiction from this Ilkhanid painting from 14th century Iran. And this is this full mandala. You see here's our Khans at the bottom, the Y's on the other side there. And this, it's all silk as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, anyone got any questions or online as well?
I have a question, if that's all right. So silk being very rare in the pre-conquest Mongol steppe, what were these robes made out of? Was it like a high-grade wool to a low-grade wool, or what's going on?
Part of the problem is we don't have any really reliable pre-conquest robes that survive. And the descriptions we get are from Chinese authors who are saying things like, oh, before the conquest, they were just wearing furs and hides, and now they're dressed in fine silks and stuff. So is this authentic, like describing how they're wearing, or is this kind of a bit of exaggeration on their part? It seems, well, wool, felt, this sort of thing is kind of this main material for making clothing because they're using sheep's wool for a lot of what they have there. So that's probably the majority or the most common other bits of leather and or not bits of leather, but made from leather and tanned hide and things like that. So
Do you know what they're wearing as undergarments?
they have undergarments. I don't know what they're made out of though. But we do have mentions of like they're wearing trousers. This is very the steppe nomadic thing is you wear trousers because if you're on horse all day.
Is there a class happening?
The reading group.
We have a class at 1:30.
All
Yeah,
right.
fine,
Yeah.
that's fine, but please come
Okay.
back later. In 20 minutes.
We better hurry.
Yeah, you can't
Uh,
move in 20 minutes.
No, what we were saying about
Oh,
the
yeah,
undergarments.
undergarments.
Yes, well, they are wearing trousers like pants underneath, and this is probably in the steppes. These are the first peoples who are wearing trousers like they introduced them to the Persians who introduced them to the Greeks and Europeans and stuff. And there's famously the I think it's the Han Dynasty in China where they want to emulate the horsemen from the steppes. So they start making people wear pants in order to be able to ride horses better. It's just a lot. Again, this part of getting onto a horse, it's a lot easier in pants and these shorter garments compared to these longer full body.
It's less painful as well if you're wearing trousers and horse.
That's part of it, but I don't know what material they are all made out of.
Speaking of riding horses, this folding in the front on this supposedly very ergonomical garment seems counterintuitive to me because when you ride a horse, the last thing you want is fabric bunching in front of you.
Yeah, but they're mostly standing when they're on the saddle, so they're kind of in a position like this, so your feet are in the stirrup and they kind of sit like this, and then the saddle is here, so you're kind of like that. And part of what is an example here, part of this waistband, the Mongols say, is it helps keep your guts where they're supposed to be, and having this kind of pressure around your stomach and lower back helps make riding more comfortable for long distance and things like that. So
Would they have like a belt with a scabbard or something as well?
yeah, do I have one of the depictions here? I don't think you can kind of see it here. So he has the waistband and then there's a belt. Oh, okay, neat. I didn't know that. And then they'd have a belt on top of that, and then from that belt hangs their bow case, the quiver, their sword, their cups, little bags, all sorts of things, knives.
So the quiver's not on the back, it's on
No.
the belt.
This is, so you see, this is his quiver right here. So he has the quiver on the right-hand side and the bow case on the left-hand side, so he can reach down. When he's on a horse, he reaches down like this and then grabs it and goes like that.
Assuming he's right-handed.
Yeah, and this is not, yeah. So this is why when the married women, they don't have to wear belts, so bushui, the beltless ones, because they don't have to be doing practical things like that. They have servants for that. But a man has to have a belt. That's where he keeps his weapons and stuff. If a man doesn't have a belt, means he can't go around with any weapons and stuff on him, probably because he's a slave or something. So
What about a lower class woman though, who would have to ride or look after animals or whatever? Would they still
they
go
would have
beltless?
belt.
They would have a belt.
They would have had belts. We have one of the references to that, and there are references to married women in times of trouble having to wear belts and things, but it seems like the ideal is that a married woman doesn't wear a belt. So. And they put like they put a lot of display of the wealth into the belts as well, so they'd be like gold or jade or silver or other precious metals and be encrusted, and they're very long things too. They wrap around and they have kind of a lot of straps hanging off of them, so you can put all sorts of buckles and whatnot on them. So, and I said, because they don't tend to have palaces, so how do you show off your wealth? You wear a lot of it, and through jewelry, like the earrings, apparently nose piercings, rings, but also everything you wear is then made out of very fine materials, and then a lot of that material, and then an excessive amount of that material. Very easy way to show off this is a very rich person, because like I said before, everyone's wearing kind of the same style of clothing, so you have to make yours stand out in ways like this.
What did they wear in battle? Do you know?
They have armor and stuff, but like.
Still
you
the
mean,
silk, or-
Are still the silk? Probably.
Shows off a lot of wealth. I'm so wealthy. I'm
I
going
mean,
into battle.
you're probably not wearing the absolute nicest
Mhm.
stuff you have unless you're the emperor or something, because if you're wearing jewel encrusted robes or kind of extra weight on there, but silk itself, because it's a light, very breathable material, is probably very comfortable to be wearing under armor and stuff, just because it's gonna let you stay a little cooler under all of that. But more typical, you'd expect them to wear more heavily padded garments because that is better protection against potential blows and things. And one of the arguments for the extra material around the lower arms is because if you are caught unawares, you can kind of have this extra fabric on your lower arm kind of be an impromptu shield to defend yourself with, because it's like piling up here and you can kind of protect yourself like that if you have to. I'm not totally on board with that, but I suppose it's better than nothing.
I was thinking about this symbolic meaning attaching to the fabric. Why would silk be so important to show off? And can we also think of other ways of explaining why would they decorate the clothing? Because not only the nomads, the sedentary population would also show off if they would also wear decorative, beautifully decorated clothing. So how do we then describe, like, is wearing a beautiful clothes only for showing off? Would that mean also some kind of aesthetic engagement? You just want to have some aesthetically beautiful. I mean, I'm trying to see something beyond functionalist explanation of things. And like the mandala you said, for example, it's not necessarily for wearing, and maybe it's not necessarily showing off. How else we can go about these things within this very limited material that we have today?
This is obviously a part of it. And I just here highlighted the functional aspects, because this is what is unique about these things, is they are still made to be functional in a certain way. Because it's still the same style of clothing as the common herder is kind of wearing. But obviously there is more value put onto it beyond just that. Now, in 12th century Mongolia, before the conquest began, where are they getting silk? Only as exchange or given as gifts from the dynasties in China to their south. So it's a very exotic thing. It's seen as very prestigious because of that, because they know that the empires to the south are placing great value on them, and some of that is being transported with it into the steppe when they receive it. They know there's a lot of effort. They don't understand how it's made. They don't have any ways to make it themselves, and it is in feel it's going to be very different from the types of clothing they have. So it has a lot of prestige coming from that and the kind of relationship it has around that. And we see this is only something the upper class, the elite, the Khan's family, this is how they're dressing. So it's seen as this is how, if you are a part of the military aristocracy, of the imperial family, this is part of your reward for that, is you get to dress in these very nice dresses. And there are some sumptuary laws that are enforced to some extent in the Mongol Empire. I don't really know them very well myself, and I don't know how long they're always actually in place, but there are laws against the specific types of these fabrics that you can wear at some events, or the colors, and because the Khan is gifting them on for he's elected, for example. We have one of the Franciscan reports is on the first day of the big feast of the election, everyone's wearing white. And then on the next day, they're all wearing red. And on the next day, they're all wearing green or something. I don't remember the exact color, but there is this idea of this community around it as well. You're all wearing the finery that was gifted to you by the emperor or the previous emperor, and you're all kind of in this circle that understands, all right, this is the order we have to wear these things. And white, for example, white and gold, these are the colors the Mongols are associating with holiness, with heaven, with imperial power. So there's a lot of symbolism behind that as well. And like I was saying, they like to combine these motifs from different parts of the empire. So it's also a way to show off the breadth of their power and their influence by going, look, we have these Chinese, these Persian weavers, they're all making these things for us and combining them all together to show off our might, our majesty. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but
Yeah. Absolutely.
you know, there is a lot of connotations on that side of it, and it's not just the practical form. This is comfortable,
Yeah.
but it is also a display of power in itself.
I'm curious about the actual economics of it in the early conquest. Do we know if they really prioritized seizing silk production in, say, the first invasion of the Jin with Genghis Khan? Or are they still not aware enough of how it happened, so they're just demanding tribute, and only later do they clue in that they need to take over the state monopoly?
They are aware of it from very early on because it becomes part of there's a brief peace arrangement between the Mongols and the Jin state, and part of that tribute is like a tremendous amount of silk that they send north. And there is probably already some silk in the steppe before the conquests begin, but probably in a very small amount, and probably just the Khans and lords who are in the steppe are really only having access to it. So what changes is once you actually start to get Mongol rule in northern China and a bit more of a stable government, then you get more of this taking control of production. And from relatively early on, they are understanding we can receive silk as taxation, make people deliver it to us. And by the 1230s, it's very ingrained as the economic aspect of like they're even talking about, hey, we can kind of pay off some of the Mongol princes who really want to do, how do I summarize this very quickly? They were all given plots of land in China to pay them like revenue. And one of the suggestions of the Mongol government was, rather than let these princes have their way with these regions individually, we will collect the taxes on their behalf and send an equivalent amount in silk to these various princes to kind of appease them. So they are not just seeing it in this purely functional means, but this is an actual way of kind of running the government to a certain extent. So it's very, very early on there.
Is it still in that, you know, obtaining and then sending through though, or are they seizing the silk farms themselves and taking over their management?
There is seizure of the northern Chinese, but a lot of this production is coming more from southern China, so they don't really have that monopoly on it. The Jin dynasty themselves, they were getting a lot of their silk from an annual tribute the southern Song dynasty was paying them.
Right.
So it was kind of a couple steps removed from the majority, as I understand it. At least.
So it's not until we're talking about like Kublai that they really have a stranglehold over the silk production.
Oh, yeah, and of course, silk is always a government monopoly as well in the history of China. So you take over what the previous dynasty had control of, and now you make it yours as well. So whatever resources the Jin had in that regard, the Mongols had that fairly early on. But northern China is so thoroughly devastated during that warfare that a lot of those reserves are kind of destroyed just in the process of the conquest. They don't really recover in some places until even the Qing dynasty, by some estimates. So.
Hi, Jack, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Online. It's a wonderful presentation. I was thinking earlier you mentioned this a lampas that's woven with precious jewels. I was wondering which are you talking about a specific textile, or is it something from a rich textual resources? And also another question is, you said you're expert in the Golden Horde, and as you probably already know, the textile from the Mongol Empire regarding the Yuan China and as well as Mongol Iran is more thoroughly studied. But I was wondering, do you have any idea on what kind of textile that has been found in Golden Horde, be it lampas or damask? Yeah. And also, earlier in one of your slides, you mentioned the Na Shishi. And I think in the Yuan Shi, in the history of Yuan Dynasty, there are two kinds of textile that's woven with gold thread that has been mentioned. But it's, as far as I know, that the other term is Jinduanzi. It seems to be different from Na Shishi, which is the lampas wave. The Jinduanzi is seems to be a wave that the gold thread is woven as a supplementary weft, not as a like a two sets of binding system as a lampas. Oh yeah, that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So firstly, regarding your first question, I don't know any specific surviving examples of that, but there are some of our descriptions of the travel accounts. I believe it's William of Rubric, for example, is mentioning, and I can double check that and send that to you if you're interested. One of them is mentioning there appears to be actual like jewels tied into the clothing as well. I don't recall the exact details off the top of my head, however. Regarding the Golden Horde, there are apparently some sections of fabric found, but I don't know what the design of it or the make of it is. I did look into it a little while ago, and I had a lot of difficulty finding basically any follow-up information on that or where it's located or things like that.
We have a class here.
Yep.
Was it 30?
Yep.
All right, we're just wrapping up just in a minute here, so. Sorry. Just on your final points, and we're getting kicked out of here in a moment, so I'll be very quick, so I apologize. So yes, on the Jinduanzi, which I'm probably just mispronounced, so I'm sorry. Yeah, I did not have an explanation. I tried reading into it and I did not quite understand what the distinction between them was, and I didn't want to kind of burden this talk by getting into that when I didn't really couldn't quite explain it, but I did come across that as well, and it's always the problem of the sources mention this thing but don't always give details beyond just the name. So as not being a specialist in the textiles myself, I didn't want to kind of overstep in that regard. So thank you for coming and listening, and I think we have to hit the road now. So.
Yeah, thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
Thank you.